Just a quick heads up before the start of this video, I created a new channel for all of my gaming content. It's called Fridge Gaming. I'll leave a link in the description for anyone interested. Thanks. In August 1914, Canada was a small dominion of just 7.5 million people, a nation still finding its identity within the British Empire. 4 years later, the Canadian Corps would stand as one of the most feared and respected military formations on the Western Front. This is the story of how a nation of farmers, lumberjacks, and shopkeepers became the soldiers that Allied commanders turned to when victory seemed impossible. This is the story of reliability forged in fire, of innovation born from necessity, and of a military force that never lost a battle under its greatest commander. But how did this transformation happen? What made the Canadians so effective? And what truth lies behind the legendary claim that even the Germans called them stormtroopers? Today, we examine the documented facts, the verified achievements, and the hard-won reputation of the Canadian Expeditionary Force in the First World War. On August 4th, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. Canada, as part of the British Empire, was automatically at war. There was no debate, no vote in Parliament. The decision was made 3,000 miles away in London. But the response from Canadians was immediate and overwhelming. Within 11 days, on August 15th, 1914, the Canadian Expeditionary Force was officially formed. From a population of only 7.5 million, smaller than modern-day New York City, Canada would eventually send 619,636 men and women to serve. Of these, 424,529 would serve overseas in the combat zones of Europe. The first contingent was a single infantry division. These were largely volunteers, and remarkably, 2/3 of them were British-born immigrants who had come to Canada seeking new opportunities. They were returning to defend the mother country. By 1918, as the war ground on, approximately 50% of the Canadian Expeditionary Force was still British-born, though native-born Canadians increasingly filled the ranks. The force would eventually expand to 4 full divisions, forming what would become known as the Canadian Corps, a unified fighting formation that would write its name in blood and glory across the battlefields of France and Belgium. It's important to note that these were volunteers. Canada relied on voluntary enlistment until 1917, when conscription was finally introduced amid fierce political controversy. But even then, only 24,132 conscripts actually reached France before the war ended. The Canadian Corps was built on the backs of men who chose to fight. They had no idea what awaited them. None of them did. April 22nd, 1915, the Ypres salient in Belgium. The Canadian Division held a section of the line between French colonial troops and British forces. It was a quiet sector, or so they thought. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, German forces released 160 tons of chlorine gas from over 5,000 cylinders along a 6-kilometer front. This was the first large-scale use of poison gas in warfare, a weapon that violated every convention of civilized combat. A greenish-yellow cloud drifted across no man's land toward the Allied trenches. The French colonial troops on the Canadian left flank broke almost immediately. Choking, blinded, and terrified by this new horror, they fled, leaving a gap of 6.5 kilometers in the Allied line. The road to the critical city of Ypres lay open. If the Germans exploited this breach, they could roll up the entire Allied position. The Canadians, many of them experiencing combat for the first time, found themselves exposed on their left flank. The gas reached their positions. Men choked and died. Others, in desperate improvisation, urinated on handkerchiefs and held them over their faces. The ammonia in urine partially neutralizing the chlorine. It was crude, but it saved lives. What happened next would define the Canadian reputation for the rest of the war. The Canadians held, under devastating poison gas attacks, Not just one, but multiple waves over the following days, under machine gun fire, under artillery bombardment that turned the earth into a moonscape of craters and corpses. The Canadians held the line. The cost was staggering. Nearly 1 in 3 Canadian soldiers became casualties. Over 6,000 men killed, wounded, or captured in just 4 days of fighting. But they did not break. They did not run. They closed the gap, counterattacked, and prevented a German breakthrough that could have changed the course of the war. In the aftermath, Canadian military scientists worked frantically to develop effective gas masks, contributing to the protective equipment that would save countless Allied lives in the years to come. Second Ypres was the baptism by fire. The Canadians had proven something crucial, not just to their British commanders, but to themselves. They could be relied upon, even under the most extreme and horrific conditions imaginable. The Western Front quickly settled into the grinding stalemate of trench warfare. From the English Channel to the Swiss border, millions of men faced each other across a wasteland of barbed wire, mud, and death. In this environment, the Canadians began to develop something that would set them apart: tactical innovation. One area where Canadians excelled was trench raiding. These were nighttime operations, where small groups of soldiers would cross no man's land, infiltrate enemy trenches, gather intelligence, kill enemy soldiers, destroy fortifications, and return before dawn. It was dangerous work, casualty rates were high, and many nations abandoned the practice as too costly. The Canadians did not abandon it. Instead, they refined it into an art form. Canadian commanders recognized that trench raids served multiple purposes. Yes, they gathered crucial intelligence about enemy positions, strength, and morale. But they also kept soldiers active and aggressive rather than waiting passively in trenches to be shelled. The psychological advantage was significant. Men who raided felt they were taking the fight to the enemy rather than simply enduring punishment. The Canadians developed specialized weapons for trench raids: clubs, knives, and improvised explosives. They trained extensively in mock trenches behind the lines. They studied the timing, the routes, the coordination required. They became experts. In the 4 months leading up to the Battle of Vimy Ridge, Canadian forces conducted 55 nighttime trench raids. Some involved just a handful of men, others involved up to 900 soldiers in coordinated assaults. Each raid brought back prisoners for interrogation, documents, and detailed information about German defenses. This intelligence would prove invaluable. But more than that, the raids created a culture of aggression and initiative within the Canadian Corps. Junior officers and NCOs learned to make decisions independently, to adapt to changing circumstances, to lead men in the chaos of combat. These were not the skills taught in peacetime military academies. These were lessons written in blood and darkness, learned in the mud and wire of no man's land, and they would make the Canadian Corps into something exceptional. To understand the effectiveness of the Canadian Corps, you must understand the man who would lead it to its greatest victories, Arthur Currie. Born December 5, 1875 in Ontario, Currie was not a professional soldier. He was a school teacher, then an insurance salesman, then a real estate broker. In 1897, he joined the militia as a gunner and slowly rose through the ranks. He had no formal military college education. He had never attended a military academy. He was, by the standards of the British Army's aristocratic officer class, a complete amateur. When war broke out, Currie commanded the 2nd Canadian Brigade. By September 1915, he had been promoted to Major General and given command of the 1st Canadian Division. His rise was based entirely on merit and results. Currie was not a charismatic leader in the traditional sense. He was tall and heavy-set, often appearing aloof and distant. His troops called him Guts and Gators, a reference to his prominent stomach and his insistence on proper military dress. He was not the kind of general who inspired men with rousing speeches or personal magnetism. What Currie possessed was something far more valuable: a brilliant tactical mind and an absolute commitment to preparation. His philosophy was simple and revolutionary: pay the price of victory in shells, not lives. In an era when British generals often seemed indifferent to casualty rates, when going over the top meant walking into machine gun fire in neat lines, Currie insisted that artillery and planning could save lives. He studied every battle, every failure, every success. He questioned both senior and junior officers to understand what worked and what didn't. He was willing to learn from anyone, regardless of rank. After the catastrophic losses of life at Verdun and the Somme, Currie traveled to France to study the failures firsthand. On January 28, 1917, he delivered a series of lectures to Canadian officers on the lessons learned. His conclusions would reshape how the Canadian Corps fought. Currie believed in detailed planning, extensive reconnaissance, thorough training, and overwhelming artillery support. He believed every soldier should understand the overall plan and their specific role in it. He believed in rehearsals, in practice, in preparation. His troops might not have loved him, but they trusted him. They knew that when Currie sent them into battle, he had done everything possible to ensure their success and survival. In the brutal calculus of war, that trust was worth more than charisma, and that trust would be tested in the most important battle of World War I. Before we reach Vimy Ridge, we must address the Somme, and a legend that has become inseparable from the Canadian story. In September 1916, the Canadian Corps arrived at the Somme, where the British and French had been locked in a catastrophic offensive since July 1st. Over 4.5 months, more than 200,000 Allied casualties would be suffered with no major breakthrough. The Somme was a charnel house, a meat grinder that consumed entire divisions. The Canadians fought with distinction, but they paid a heavy price in blood. What they gained was experience, hard, bitter experience in the realities of modern warfare. It was during or after the Somme that a legend began to circulate, that the Germans had begun calling the Canadians Sturmtruppen, stormtroopers, in recognition of their bravery and effectiveness. This claim appears in a 1918 speech by Captain J.B. Paulin at the Empire Club of Canada, where he quoted an unnamed officer saying the Kaiser had called the Canadians the stormtroops of the British Empire. The story spread, was repeated in newspapers, and became part of Canadian military folklore. But here's where we must be careful with historical accuracy. Sturmtruppen was actually a German term for their own elite assault units, specialized troops trained in infiltration tactics and close quarters combat. These German stormtroopers were a specific military innovation, not a general term of respect for enemy forces. When we examine primary German sources from the period, we find limited direct evidence of Germans specifically calling Canadians Sturmtruppen. What we do find is that British and Allied press frequently called the Canadians shock troops and storm troops, terms that reflected their role as the spearhead of difficult attacks. The official Canadian government position acknowledges that Canadians earned a formidable reputation, but notes that the sources for the stormtrooper nickname are unclear and possibly apocryphal. It appears more likely that this was a case of Allied propaganda, self-applied mythology, or a misunderstanding of German military terminology rather than a verified German designation. Does this mean the Canadian reputation was undeserved? Absolutely not. What is documented? What is verified in countless German military reports and prisoner interrogations is that German forces feared and respected the Canadian Corps. German commanders knew that when Canadians appeared in a sector, a major attack was imminent. German soldiers knew that Canadians were aggressive, well-trained, and extremely dangerous opponents. The Canadians didn't need a German nickname to validate their effectiveness. Their record speaks for itself, and that record was about to be written in the mud and blood of Vimy Ridge. Vimy Ridge. Even today, the name resonates in Canadian history like no other battle. The ridge itself is a 7-kilometer escarpment in northern France, rising to 145 meters at its highest point, known as Hill 145. It doesn't sound like much. 145 meters is less than 500 feet. But on the flat plains of northern France, Vimy Ridge was a fortress. From its heights, observers could see for miles across the Douai Plain. Whoever held Vimy controlled the surrounding territory. The Germans had held it since 1914. They had fortified it extensively. Deep bunkers, multiple trench lines, machine gun nests, artillery positions, and miles of barbed wire. The ridge was considered impregnable. The French had tried to take it in 1915. The result was catastrophic. 200,000 French soldiers killed in repeated failed assaults. The British tried in 1916. They failed. Vimy Ridge had become a symbol of the stalemate, a position that could not be taken. In early 1917, the Canadian Corps was given the task. The British High Command was not optimistic, but the Canadians had something the previous attackers had lacked: Arthur Currie's obsessive preparation and the lessons learned from years of failure. Lieutenant General Sir Julian Byng commanded the Canadian Corps, with Major General Arthur Currie commanding the 1st Division. Together, they planned an assault unlike anything attempted before on the Western Front. Currie had studied the failures at Verdun and the Somme in meticulous detail. He had questioned both senior and junior French officers, comparing their perspectives to understand where planning had failed and where execution had broken down. He had identified the key problems: inadequate artillery preparation, poor coordination between infantry and artillery, soldiers who didn't understand their objectives, and no contingency planning when things went wrong. The Canadians would do it differently. Behind the lines, they constructed a full-scale mock battlefield replicating the German defenses on Vimy Ridge. For months, all 100,000 soldiers of the Canadian Corps trained on this replica. They practiced their attacks again and again, timing every movement, learning every objective. And here's what was revolutionary. Every single soldier was given a map and briefed on the overall plan. In most armies, only officers knew the objectives. Common soldiers were simply told to follow orders. But Currie insisted that if officers were killed, and they would be, the men needed to know what to do next. Plans were distributed down to the platoon and section level. Every man knew not just his own job, but the jobs of the men around him. Extensive reconnaissance, using aerial photographs, provided detailed intelligence on German positions. The 55 trench raids conducted in the months before the battle brought back prisoners, documents, and precise information about German tunnels, machine gun positions, and defensive plans. The Canadians assembled 983 artillery pieces for the preparatory bombardment. For weeks before the assault, they pounded German positions, destroying fortifications and cutting wire. But the real innovation was the creeping barrage. This technique had actually been used before, most famously at the Somme, but not as effectively. The creeping barrage was a technique where artillery fire moved forward in timed intervals just ahead of advancing infantry. The infantry would follow close behind this moving wall of explosions, close enough that German defenders couldn't emerge from their bunkers without being caught in the barrage, but not so close that Canadian soldiers were killed by their own artillery. This required extraordinary coordination and discipline. Artillery officers and infantry commanders had to synchronize their watches. Soldiers had to advance at a precise pace. Too fast and they'd walk into their own shells. Too slow and they'd give the Germans time to set up machine guns. The training on the mock battlefield made this possible. As Canadian military historian G.W.L. Nicholson would later write, it was one of the most precisely timed artillery movements of the war. April 9th, 1917, dawn, Easter Monday. The assault began. For the first time in the war, all 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps attacked together as a unified force. Through snow and sleet, 100,000 Canadian soldiers went over the top. The creeping barrage worked exactly as planned. German defenders, huddled in their bunkers during the preparatory bombardment, emerged to find Canadian soldiers already on top of them. The weeks of training paid off. When officers fell, sergeants took command. When sergeants fell, corporals led. When communications broke down, soldiers knew their objectives and continued the advance. By noon on April 9th, most of the ridge was in Canadian hands. The 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Divisions had achieved all their objectives. The 4th Division faced the hardest fighting at Hill 145, the highest point of the ridge, but they took it on April 10th. On April 12th, the final German strongpoint, known as the Pimple, fell to Canadian forces. The Germans were forced to retreat 3 kilometers to the east. Vimy Ridge, the position that had resisted all attacks for 3 years, had fallen in 3 days. The cost was significant: 10,602 Canadian casualties, including 3,598 killed. But in the context of World War I, where British offensives often suffered 60,000 casualties in a single day for no gain, Vimy was a stunning success. The Canadians had captured more ground, more prisoners, and more artillery than any previous British offensive in the war. The victory that had eluded the French and British had been achieved by the Canadians. The significance of Vimy Ridge extends far beyond military tactics. Canadian historian Pierre Berton famously wrote, "In the muddy fields of northern France, Canada became a nation." For the first time, all 4 Canadian divisions had fought together. For the first time, Canadians had achieved a major victory under their own commanders. The battle became a defining moment in Canadian national identity, the moment when Canada stepped out from Britain's shadow. For the military, Vimy proved that the Canadian Corps was an elite fighting formation. General Byng was promoted to command Britain's Third Army. On June 9, 1917, Arthur Currie was knighted and became the first Canadian to command the Canadian Corps. From this point forward, the Canadians would be given the hardest, most crucial tasks, and it would not fail. Under Currie's full command, the Canadian Corps continued to prove its effectiveness. In August 1917, at the Battle of Hill 70 near Lens, Currie commanded his first major operation as Corps commander. It was a hard-won victory against fierce German resistance, but the Canadians achieved their objectives and held the position against multiple German counterattacks. Hill 70 demonstrated that Vimy was not a fluke. The Canadian methods worked consistently. Then came Passchendaele. October to November 1917, the Third Battle of Ypres, known as Passchendaele, was a British offensive that had been grinding forward through mud and blood since July. By October, the offensive had stalled in the worst conditions imaginable. Constant rain had turned the battlefield into a swamp. Men and horses drowned in shell craters filled with water. The mud was so deep that wounded men who fell off the duckboard paths simply sank and disappeared. British Field Marshal Douglas Haig ordered the Canadian Corps to take the village of Passchendaele, which sat on a low ridge overlooking the battlefield. Currie opposed the operation, arguing that the objective wasn't worth the casualties it would cost. He estimated it would cost 16,000 Canadian casualties. Haig insisted. Currie was ordered to proceed. Currie planned a 4-phase attack, each phase carefully prepared with the same meticulous attention to detail that had won Vimy Ridge. From October 26th to November 10th, the Canadians attacked. The conditions were indescribable. Men fought in mud up to their waists, artillery sank into the ground, wounded men drowned before they could be evacuated. But the Canadians took Passchendaele. 4 days to reach the outskirts of the village, 2 weeks to clear all German resistance. The cost was terrible, nearly 30,000 casualties, even worse than Currie's estimate. But they had succeeded where others had failed. Currie was right to oppose the battle. Passchendaele was a Pyrrhic victory, a village that would be abandoned months later when the Germans launched their spring offensive. But the fact that the Canadians succeeded, even under impossible conditions, further cemented their reputation. When a task seemed insurmountable, when other formations had failed, the British High Command increasingly turned to the Canadians. And the Canadians, at terrible cost, delivered results. By 1918, the Canadian Corps was regarded by friend and foe as the most effective Allied formation on the Western Front. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George called Currie a brilliant military commander and seriously considered appointing him to command all British forces. An extraordinary suggestion for a colonial officer with no formal military education. The Canadians had earned a reputation. When the task was insurmountable, call the Canadians. When a position had to be taken, regardless of cost, send the Canadians. When you needed absolute reliability, the Canadian Corps was the formation you wanted. This reputation was built on several factors: Currie's emphasis on preparation and planning, the Corps' discipline and training, their tactical innovations, and perhaps most importantly, their refusal to fail. The Canadian Corps had developed a culture where failure was simply not acceptable. They would pay whatever price was necessary to achieve their objectives. German military intelligence tracked the Canadian Corps carefully. When Canadians appeared in a sector, German commanders knew a major attack was coming. They reinforced their positions, brought up reserves, and prepared for the worst. The presence of Canadians was a warning sign that could not be ignored. This was the force that would spearhead the final Allied offensive of the war. August 8th, 1918. The Battle of Amiens, the beginning of what would be called the 100 Days Offensive, the final Allied push that would end the war. The Canadian Corps, reinforced with British and Australian units, led the assault. In a single day, they advanced 12 kilometers, an almost unimaginable distance on the Western Front, where gains were usually measured in meters. They captured 9,000 German prisoners and 200 artillery pieces. German General Erich Ludendorff called August 8th the Black Day of the German Army. It was the beginning of the end. For the next 100 days, the Canadian Corps was at the forefront of the Allied advance. They fought at Amiens, at Arras, at Cambrai, at Valenciennes, and finally at Mons, the Belgian city where the British had first fought the Germans in 1914. The Canadians liberated Mons on November 11th, 1918, just hours before the armistice took effect. The list of Canadian victories during the 100 days is staggering. They broke through the Drocourt-Quéant line, considered one of the strongest German defensive positions. They crossed the Canal du Nord, a seemingly impossible obstacle. They captured Cambrai, a major German logistics hub. Each victory brought the Allies closer to Germany and made German defeat inevitable. But the cost was horrific. In those final 100 days, the Canadian Corps suffered 45,800 casualties, nearly as many as they had suffered in the previous 3 years combined. Some soldiers began to whisper that Currie was callous, that he was sacrificing lives to enhance his own reputation and ensure Canada had a prominent role in the final victory. These accusations would haunt Currie after the war. In 1928, a Canadian newspaper published an article accusing him of needlessly sacrificing Canadian lives in the final days of the war. Currie sued for libel. During the trial, military experts testified that Currie's careful planning and emphasis on artillery support had actually saved lives, that casualty rates under his command were lower than under other commanders facing similar challenges. Currie won the case, but the accusations left a bitter taste. The truth is complex. Yes, casualties were high during the 100 days, but the Canadian Corps was being used as the spearhead for the most difficult operations precisely because they were so effective. They were given the hardest tasks because they succeeded where others failed. And Currie's methods, his insistence on preparation, on artillery support, on detailed planning, did save lives compared to the alternative of simply throwing men at German machine guns. Under Currie's command, the Canadian Corps never lost a battle. That record came at a price, but it was a price that ended the war. When the guns finally fell silent on November 11th, 1918, Canada counted the cost. 60,661 Canadians had been killed, 9.28% of those who enlisted. Another 172,000 were wounded. Of frontline soldiers, over one-third, 154,000 men, were wounded but survived. 4 out of 5 wounded soldiers recovered sufficiently to return to duty, a testament to improving medical care as the war progressed. From a population of 7.5 million, Canada had sent over 600,000 to war. Nearly every family in the country had been touched by loss. But Canada had also gained something. The nation that entered the war as an automatic extension of British foreign policy emerged with a new sense of independence. Canada insisted on signing the Treaty of Versailles as a separate nation, not as part of the British delegation. Canada became a distinct member of the League of Nations, with its own voice in international affairs. The Canadian Corps emerged from the war as one of the most well-regarded fighting forces in military history. Their achievements at Vimy Ridge, Hill 70, Passchendaele, and during the 100 Days Offensive had proven that Canadians could not only fight alongside the great powers, they could lead. The sacrifice was immeasurable. The legacy was profound. So what made the Canadian Corps so effective? Why did they succeed where others failed? First, leadership. Arthur Currie's emphasis on planning, preparation, and artillery coordination was revolutionary. His philosophy of paying the price in shells rather than lives saved countless soldiers while achieving objectives. His willingness to learn from anyone, regardless of rank, and to study both successes and failures created a culture of continuous improvement. Second, innovation. The Canadians refined the creeping barrage into an art form. They mastered trench raiding when others abandoned it. They developed combined arms tactics that integrated infantry, artillery, engineers, and aircraft in coordinated operations. They were willing to try new approaches and discard what didn't work. Third, training. The extensive rehearsals before Vimy Ridge, where every soldier trained on a full-scale replica of the battlefield, became standard practice. Soldiers knew their objectives, understood the overall plan, and could adapt when things went wrong. This training created initiative and flexibility at all levels. Fourth, intelligence. The trench raids provided crucial information about enemy positions, strength, and morale. The Canadians went into battle knowing what they faced, not charging blindly into the unknown. Fifth, decentralized command. Junior officers and NCOs were empowered to make decisions. When senior officers fell, the attack continued, because everyone knew what needed to be done. This was revolutionary in an era when most armies relied on rigid, top-down command structures. Sixth, determination. The Canadian Corps developed a culture where failure was not acceptable. They would pay whatever price was necessary to achieve their objectives. This wasn't recklessness, it was combined with careful planning and preparation, but it meant that when Canadians were given a task, commanders could rely on them to complete it. Seventh, cohesion. Unlike British divisions that were constantly broken up and reassigned, the 4 Canadian divisions fought together as a unified corps. They developed shared tactics, shared experiences, and shared pride. They were not just soldiers, they were Canadians, fighting for their nation's reputation. Finally, learning. The Canadians studied every battle, every success, every failure. They adapted continuously, incorporating lessons learned and discarding tactics that didn't work. They were not bound by tradition or doctrine. They were pragmatic, focused on what worked. These factors combined to create a military force that was greater than the sum of its parts. Let's return to the question of the stormtrooper nickname one final time. Did the Germans actually call the Canadians Sturmtruppen? The historical evidence is unclear at best. The term appears in Allied sources, in Canadian speeches, in British newspapers, but primary German sources are ambiguous. It seems more likely that this was a case of Allied propaganda, self-identification, or a misunderstanding of German military terminology. But here's what matters. The reputation was earned through documented, verifiable achievements. German military reports show that German commanders feared facing the Canadian Corps. German soldiers knew that Canadians were dangerous opponents. When Canadians appeared in a sector, it meant a major attack was coming, and German forces prepared accordingly. The British High Command used the Canadians as their shock troops, the formation they turned to for the hardest, most crucial operations. This wasn't propaganda, this was operational reality reflected in orders, battle plans, and after-action reports. Whether the Germans called them stormtroopers or not, the Canadians were used as the spearhead of Allied offensives. They were given the objectives that seemed impossible, and they achieved them. The legend of the nickname has become part of Canadian military mythology, and like many legends, it contains a kernel of truth wrapped in layers of embellishment and national pride. What we can say with certainty is that the Canadian Corps earned a reputation for effectiveness, reliability, and determination that was recognized by all sides. Their legacy doesn't rest on a disputed nickname. It rests on Vimy Ridge, on Hill 70, on Passchendaele, on the 100 Days Offensive, and on the 60,661 Canadians who never came home. In August 1914, Canada was a small dominion of 7.5 million people, automatically at war because Britain was at war. 4 years later, Canada sat at the peace conference as a nation in its own right, having earned that place through sacrifice and achievement on the battlefields of Europe. The transformation was remarkable. Farmers, lumberjacks, shopkeepers, and clerks became soldiers. Soldiers became veterans. Veterans became the foundation of a nation that had proven itself in the crucible of the Western Front. The Canadian Corps, under leaders like Arthur Currie, demonstrated that innovation, preparation, and determination could overcome even the most horrific conditions of modern warfare. They showed that a relatively small nation could produce a military force that stood among the best in the world. The cost was staggering. 60,661 killed, 172,000 wounded, countless others, scarred by experiences that could never be fully expressed. Every Canadian family was touched by the war. The nation that emerged in 1918 was not the same nation that had entered in 1914. Whether called stormtroopers, shock troops, or simply the Canadian Corps, their effectiveness was undeniable. Their reliability under impossible conditions earned them the respect of allies and enemies alike. Their sacrifice was immeasurable. Canada entered the First World War as a colony. It emerged as a nation, forged in the mud and blood of Flanders and France, tempered by 4 years of the most brutal warfare in human history. The Canadian Corps never lost a battle under Arthur Currie's command. That record stands as a testament to the soldiers who fought, the leaders who planned, and the nation that sent them to war. We remember them, we honor their sacrifice, and we recognize that the Canada we know today was built, in part, on the battlefields where they fought and died. Now, I'd like to hear from you. What do you think? Was the Canadian Corps the most effective fighting force in World War I? Given their record of victories, their innovative tactics, and their reliability in the most difficult operations, do they deserve that distinction? Or do other forces, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the Germans, or perhaps the French, have an equal claim to that title? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective on this question. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into Canadian military history, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more thoroughly researched historical content. There are so many stories from the Great War that deserve to be told with accuracy and respect. Thank you for watching.